So if you'd stop right there and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
Sir, come up. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning, Your Honor.
There's been a motion to sequester witnesses in the case, so until all the evidence is over, you can only be in the courtroom when you're testifying and not talk about your testimony with the other witnesses. I'll let them talk about theirs with you.
I understand, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Ms. McDougal, please.
Good morning, Dr. Kinshirf. In a loud, clear voice, can you state your first and last names, please?
Robert Kinshirf.
And can you spell your first and your last name?
Robert, R-O-B-E-R-T. Kinshirf, K-I-N-S-C-H-E-R-F-F.
Dr. Kinshirf, how are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed primarily at William James College, which is a graduate school of psychology here in the Boston area. I'm there as an associate vice president. My portfolio of responsibilities are the programs at our school that provide direct services to people. I'm also on the faculty of the doctoral program in clinical psychology and also on the teaching faculty of the school psychology program.
And Dr. Kinshirf, can you briefly describe for us your educational background, please?
I received my bachelor's degree in political science and social sciences at the University of California at Berkeley in 1972. Received a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago in 1980. My PhD in clinical psychology with a child emphasis from the City University of New York in 1988. And my law degree from Harvard Law School in 1992.
Can you describe for us, let me ask you this, how long have you been in your current position at William James?
In my current position since 2012, I believe.
And where were you employed full-time before that?
Prior to that time, I had been employed also at William James College, but not as a senior administrator. I was the director of forensic services for that period of time, and I had held positions at Easter Seals of New Hampshire, while also acting as a consultant on juvenile court clinics to the Administrative Office of the Juvenile Court.
And specifically with respect to your duties at Easter Seals of New Hampshire, what type of an agency is the Easter Seals of New Hampshire, and what were your responsibilities?
Easter Seals of New Hampshire is a large social and clinical services provider. I was the director of clinical services. My responsibilities there included clinical oversight for residential treatment program for children and a risk assessment and management program for the agency.
Now, Doctor, you indicated in that time you were also doing some work for the Office of the Trial Court for the Juvenile Court Clinic. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, how long have you done work of a variety of types for the Juvenile Court Clinic?
I first became involved with the Juvenile Court Clinic in 1985 and for a time was a staff member there. I subsequently became the director of Juvenile Court Clinic Services in the Administrative Office of the Juvenile Court and served in that role from about 1998 or 1999 until 2005 when I left for service at the Department of Mental Health. In that particular job at the Department of Mental Health, I also had an ongoing professional relationship with the Administrative Office of the Juvenile Court because the Department of Mental Health and the trial court jointly administer the Juvenile Court Clinic services. And in my role as an assistant commissioner at DMH, that was within my job responsibilities.
And with your work for the juvenile court, have you done evaluations of different kinds for the Juvenile Court Clinic?
Yes, I have.
What types of evaluations have you done?
I've done evaluations in delinquency matters, child abuse and neglect, status offender matters, children who are runaway, truant, stubborn. I've seen a range of cases over the years from very, very minor truancy cases to homicide cases.
And Dr. Kinshirf, when you would do when you've done evaluations through the juvenile court clinic, are they for a party, meaning one side or the other, or are they at the judge's behest, or both?
They're done in a court order. I have done other work retained by counsel, but when it's through the juvenile court or the juvenile court clinics, it's always directly by order of the court.
The judge has asked that an evaluation be done not for one side or for the other, but for the court's purposes.
That's correct.
Now, Doctor, I think I sort of skipped over this, but can you describe any licensures that you hold at this time?
Yes, I'm admitted to the bar as an attorney in Massachusetts, but my primary work in psychology is covered under 3 licenses. I'm licensed in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Texas.
And Doctor, can you explain to us what the certificate program means to be a designated forensic professional, a designated forensic mental health supervisor, and a designated juvenile court clinician?
Some years ago, the trial court and the Department of Mental Health decided to implement a process of education and training for people who would be doing court-ordered evaluations in the trial court. On the adult side, these people are called designated forensic professionals, DFPs. They are doctoral level psychologists and psychiatrists. On the juvenile side, they are called certified juvenile court clinicians. I have been trained both as a DFP and as a CJCC, as they are called, and I'm also qualified to serve essentially as a supervisor or instructor for those who are in training to earn those certifications.
And how far back does your designation go?
May I check my CV?
Sure.
I know the designated forensic professional goes back probably to the mid to late 1980s, but let me just check here briefly. And I'm sorry, if you have a page.
Page 2.
Page 2, thank you. Designated forensic professional from 1993 and ongoing. Designated forensic mental health supervisor from 1994 and still ongoing. And since 2001 and ongoing, designated juvenile court clinician and mentor. Levels 1 and 2. Levels 1 and 2 differentiate between those cases which are routinely before the juvenile court, but do not always have specific legal questions before them. Level 2 designates specific training and competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility evaluations.
And Dr. Kinscherf, do you also do writing and research?
I do.
Have you been published in peer-reviewed journals?
I have.
On what types of topics have you been published in peer-reviewed journals?
My publications cover a range including ethics and law in professional practice, risk assessment and management of violent offenders, both juvenile and adults, violent non-sexual offenders and juvenile sexual offenders, approaches to forensic evaluation.
And Doctor, did you recently receive a professional honor regarding the American Psychological Association?
Yes, I was recently designated a fellow of the American Psychological Association.
And how does one get designated a fellow?
That is a process by which candidates are reviewed and then approved by the board of the American Psychological Association. It's an award intended to recognize professional contributions over the course of a career.
And Dr. Kinscherf, have you previously testified in the state and federal courts of Massachusetts and New England?
I have, yes.
And in terms of your, how long has it been that you've been a testifying witness in the state courts of Massachusetts?
Since the beginning of my employment at the Boston Juvenile Court Clinic in the early 1980s.
In understanding some of those times you are testifying not on anyone's behalf but at the behest of the court, is that correct?
Well, each of the times that I would have been in that professional role, it would have been for that purpose.
Okay. Meaning work for the court clinic?
Work for the court clinic, yes. It would have been under court order.
but you've indicated that there have been times since your work for the court clinic has become somewhat less, that you've also been retained by one side or the other to do an evaluation and testify to those results. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And with respect to your work in, and does that include work in both, well, why don't I just ask you, what courts have you testified in, Doctor?
I've testified in district courts and superior courts. My agreement with the juvenile court is that I will not take any juvenile court matters while I have any kind of professional relationship with the court.
Have you also had occasion to either testify for or do work in federal court?
Yes, I have.
And where is that?
I've done work and testified in the federal district courts in New Hampshire and in Vermont.
And Dr. Kinshirk, with respect to when you've testified in the federal courts of New Hampshire and Vermont, has that been as a retained expert?
It has, yes.
And for which side?
I think for the federal courts in New Hampshire, it's largely been prosecution through the federal attorney's office for those districts.
And with respect to your testimony in the state courts of Massachusetts, how much of your work has been retained by the prosecution versus retained by the defense?
Most of it, actually, a significant majority of it has been retained by the defense, mostly through the Committee for Public Counsel Services.
Now, Doctor, in this particular case, were you retained well, let me ask you this before I go to that. During the work that you've described or other work that I haven't had you describe, have you had occasion to work with children and adolescents, particularly adolescents, experiencing psychosis?
Yes.
How, let me ask you this, what is the range of illness that has been experienced by the young people that you've worked with over your career?
The range of illnesses that I have seen have been children where if they warranted a diagnosis at all, it would be one like an adjustment disorder, which simply reflects a kind of a transient, stressful time in a person's life where they may have more trouble sleeping or focusing or something like that at one extreme, and at the other extreme, I have worked with children who have been profoundly impaired by a psychotic disorder, by an autism spectrum disorder, bipolar disorder,
And
very serious mental illnesses.
I'm sorry. Doctor, have you only worked with those young people in a forensic evaluation setting, or have you worked with them in a clinical setting as well?
I've worked with them in a clinical setting as well, often as a consultant to hospitals, inpatient units, or clinicians who have a particularly complicated case, but I also was responsible for the care of the children at the Easter Seals residential facility.
And did the children at the Easter Seals facility span that range of symptoms and mental illness when you were in charge of their care?
They didn't span the full range. They were largely children who were sufficiently impaired that they were difficult or impossible to maintain in the community, and so they were in a facilities-based care. Now,
Doctor, based on your training and experience, how common is severe psychosis in young children?
It's uncommon.
If you were treating, say, a 10-year-old who you just determined was overtly psychotic, what, if any, steps would you take?
If I was treating a child at that age who was suffering from psychotic symptoms, I would certainly seek a medication consultation from a skilled child and adolescent psychiatrist with a particular focus upon the management of psychotic illnesses in children. I would request psychological testing in order to get more information about the functional capacities of the child and the degree to which the psychosis was impairing their function. I would try and work with the parents or other caregivers in order to help them understand the illness and management strategies to minimize the impact of functioning upon that child.
And in your experience, when you're dealing with a child who's experiencing overt psychosis, would it be obvious to a caregiver?
Yes. I would say that particularly over a period of time, what you tend to see in younger children, particularly of the age you're describing, 9, 10, and 11, is a period of time where there may be some initial withdrawal of a child, for example, which might be attributed initially to stress or worries, kind of nonspecific, not entirely clear. But the course over time for young children is to have more clear symptoms and to express them, especially since younger children don't always grasp how strange they may look to other people in terms of their behavior. And it would be characteristic of a young child with a psychotic disorder to show impairment over time and underachieve in multiple domains. So a child who used to have friends withdraws. A child who used to be able to do well in school suddenly is unable to achieve in school, or over time is unable to achieve in school. They lose interest in activities that they've previously been interested in. Some of them will report or acknowledge, if asked, that they're having unusual kinds of experiences. Auditory or visual hallucinations. In younger children, visual hallucinations are more common at the outset.
Now, can you explain to us the relationship, as you understand it based on your training and experience, between an adolescent experiencing mental health symptoms and the how you would expect that to develop into or not develop into a subsequent mental illness diagnosis as an adult?
There will be young people who will show what is called a prodrome. This is sort of a cluster of symptoms and impairments. Many of these often start off as the so-called negative symptoms. These are things like lack of interest in things, social withdrawal, kind of oddities of thought that they may or may not share with other people. Over time, some of these young children or these adolescents will develop more explicit so-called active symptoms, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, delusions. They may have, in fact, as they move towards a clearer picture of a psychotic disorder, they frequently will show very disorganized speech, sometimes even seeming to be incoherent or completely sort of uncommunicative. They're speaking, but they're really not making much sense. Significantly disorganized behaviors that people will notice. Often that cluster comes together in the late teens to mid-20s if they're going to develop a diagnosis like schizophrenia, and they'll be diagnosed on the basis of a first psychotic break.
And what is the typical age of diagnosis for full-blown schizophrenia?
For a first psychotic break, it's usually late teens into early 20s. There are times when people have a psychotic break or symptoms of psychosis and they never go on to develop a full picture of schizophrenia, which is a chronic illness in most people that will continue to impair them over the course of their lifetime to varying degrees and need to be managed. But it might take depending upon what the first psychotic break looked like, it might take a second clear break for somebody to then receive the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Now, doctor, in July of 2015, were you retained to do a forensic evaluation of Philip Chism?
Yes, I was.
And by whom were you retained?
I was retained by you.
And what is the, what do you look to get to begin a forensic evaluation of someone Philip Chism's age for criminal responsibility?
I look to get as much information about the individual as I can. I am particularly interested in a detailed developmental history that might help me understand whether or not at the time of the offense they were possibly suffering from a mental illness or a mental defect ordinarily thought of as some kind of intellectual disability. So I would be interested in a developmental history. This would include relationships with their friends, their school functioning, their relationships with their families, their interests and activities, their medical history, their prior legal history, whether or not they've had any prior history of being identified as having psychological difficulties for purposes of special educational planning or evaluation or treatment as an outpatient.
And were you able to obtain information initially before you began the process of meeting with Philip Chism?
Yes.
And what role does your actual interactions yourself with Philip Chism play in your ultimate evaluation?
There are a couple of roles that my interactions with him play. The first is to try and see this young person in the context of the developmental history that I've been able to review, gather together, and try and understand him first as a young person. Then I will use the initial interviews to make some threshold determinations as to whether or not psychological testing might be helpful or other kinds of consultation or evaluation. I will also begin the process of gathering, when I can, the defendant's account of the events, their own understanding of what occurred, what, if any, relationship there is between any signs or symptoms of mental illness or defect. And I will try and put together as comprehensive a picture as I can of the person's functioning up to the date of the offense. I like to do that as an initial stage because there is a phenomenon known as hindsight bias. It's the phenomenon that all of us have. We all know on Monday morning what the better call would have been in a football game. And so we tend, if we're not careful, to look back and say, aha, this all links together, this all makes sense. So I like to sort of stop just before the date of offense and say, if somebody had brought me this young person on that day, what would I have gathered? What would I have thought was going on? Or would I have thought they were significantly ill or impaired as a result of a mental illness or other factor? And then I like to move forward in time to sort of see how this picture fits together in terms of the offense that they have been charged with.
And do you make an evaluation, or do you also gather information regarding the offense that they were charged with as part of your evaluation?
Yes, I try to get as much information as I can because I'm trying to put together all of the pieces of the puzzle. So it's important to me to have a fairly detailed account, if at all possible, of what has transpired down to what people said, how people behaved.
Now, doctor, in this particular case, did you, can you describe for us the sources of information that you ultimately used in forming your opinion regarding the criminal responsibility of Philip Chism?
Yes, they're voluminous, so I'll do sort of a summary, but may I refer to my report?
Is your memory exhausted as to the details of your sources of information, doctor?
I'm sorry?
Is your memory exhausted as to all of the sources of information you relied on?
Well, let me give it a start then.
Okay.
No objection to Dr. Kincher's reading if he wants.
Okay, all right.
Whichever you prefer,
may refer
doctor.
to your notes if it helps you refresh your memory. There's no objection to the foundation.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and start, and then if I need more detail or if I think I may have left something out, I'll check. I interviewed Philip Chism on a number of occasions between July and October 3rd of this year for a total of approximately 13 hours. I reviewed psychological testing reports conducted by Dr. Hebben and Dr. Casey. I also reviewed reports that had been prepared by defense experts. I reviewed medical records, legal records, educational records of Philip Chism and his family members. I reviewed crime scene photographs, surveillance tapes. I read in transcript, but also listened to interviews of persons that had been approached and interviewed in the course of the investigation by both the defense and the prosecution, of persons in Tennessee, family members, students at Danvers High School, faculty members at Danvers High School. I also walked through the school in order to sort of put together the scene in my head so I could sort of understand a little bit more than I did from looking at surveillance tapes, which were a little disjointed, seen in isolation for me. I also went and examined evidence in the evidence room that maintained by the Commonwealth, and amongst the things that I looked at there were items belonging to Mr. Chism that had been located at the scene, including some schoolwork and other things that were in backpacks, knapsacks, items belonging to Mr. Chism, apparently a box cutter, for example, clothing, and items belonging to the victim.
And Doctor, just for clarification's sake, you indicated you ultimately reviewed reports of defense experts. Did you have those prior to completing your own report in this case?
No, I did not.
Okay. And Doctor, ultimately, based on all of those sources of information, did you reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty regarding the criminal responsibility of Philip Chism?
Yes, I did.
And before you just testify to that opinion, can you tell us what you look at, what you're looking for in forming an opinion as to criminal responsibility?
In forming an opinion about criminal responsibility, I'm essentially walking through the legal standard for it. I'm first looking for whether or not there is evidence of a mental disease or defect as it's understood under the law. I then look to see whether or not, if there was a mental disease or defect, there is evidence that the defendant was substantially impaired in their ability to either appreciate the wrongfulness or criminality of their act or to conform their conduct to the requirements of law. So I'm essentially marching through the legal standard, trying to put the information and evidence that I have into this kind of logical progression.
And with respect to whether Philip Chism was suffering a mental disease or defect on October 22nd of 2013, did you reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
I did.
What was that opinion?
My opinion is that on the date of the alleged offense, Mr. Chism was not suffering from a mental disease or defect.
And despite having reached that opinion, did you go on to march along through the rest of the standard?
Yes, I did.
And did you reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty as to whether he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct and could conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
I did reach an opinion onto that.
What was that opinion?
My opinion was that although Mr. Chism at the time may have been showing some indications of distress or emotional disturbance, that to the extent to which they were present, they did not substantially impair his capacity to distinguish the wrongfulness or criminality of his act, to identify that, nor did it substantially impair his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of law.
And to be clear, Doctor, you're looking back to October 22nd of 2013, is that correct?
That's correct.
And how do you go about doing that? You talked a little bit about this hindsight effect, but how do you go about, because when you saw Philip Chism, it was in July, August, September, and October of 2015, correct?
That's correct.
What tools do you use to look back?
I use a variety of approaches. One of the things that I try to do is to collect what information I can about of observations of individuals near the time, at the time, or subsequent to the time of the alleged offense. So people who may have interacted with the individual. I look closely at records if an individual has been maintained in a facility where there is staffing that maintains continuous observation over an individual. I will look to see whether or not there are other evaluations or testings that have been done closer to the time of the offense. Because we're looking at the state of the mind of the individual at the time of the offense, it's really important to get as much information that's specific to that time frame and shortly after to really sort of understand what was going at that period of time. In this particular case, I also thought it was important to ask for psychological testing, which was subsequently conducted by Drs. Hebben and Casey, and I also spent a great deal of time with the defendant trying to understand what his experiences were over the course of his life, to be sure, but most specifically around the time of the alleged offense.
And without going into anything the defendant said to you, can you please relay to us your observations of Mr. Chism's demeanor and any other observations you made during the 13 hours or so that you spent with him?
Yes. Mr. Chism's demeanor for the most part was relatively reserved, at times guarded, at times guarded to the point that he terminated the interviews with me rather than to respond to questions or even to move on to other questions, because I had told him that if there were things he didn't want to respond to, he could just tell me and we would move on. There were times when he seemed to be distracted, looking off into space, but he was readily brought back from those distractions, if you will, focused easily, and at no time did I find his thought process incoherent, difficult to follow. At no time did I find his ability to communicate to me to be impaired at times that I thought he wanted me to understand something. There were moments, particularly when he was talking about things that he wanted me to pay attention to or which were of interest to him, when he was fairly animated.
Different than he was sort of overall?
Yes, along a continuum. He was always reserved. I would never have described him as somebody who was exuberant or engaging in the kinds of humor that adolescents often do. But there were times when he was clearly more interested in some topics rather than others, either to help me understand something he was trying to convey to me or because it was a topic of interest to him.
Now, and fair to say, Doctor, that your interactions with Mr. Chism over those 13 hours were significant to your ultimate opinion in this case?
Yes.
Doctor, you, I believe, had indicated one of your other sources of information were records regarding Mr. Chism's family. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And specifically, did that involve records which had been admitted of the defendant's maternal grandmother and maternal aunt?
That's correct.
And in your review of those records, what was the overall diagnosis for the defendant's, let me ask you this, did they have the same diagnosis or did they vary?
There was a little, if my recollection is correct, there was a little discrepancy in diagnosis in that I believe one of the relatives at one point received a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but on balance, the consensus of the diagnosis appeared to be schizoaffective disorder.
For both of them?
That's my recollection.
And what is schizoaffective disorder?
Schizoaffective disorder is a psychotic disorder in which a person's psychosis varies with swings in their mood.
And how does it differ from schizophrenia?
In schizophrenia, while you can have some variation in mood, particularly when a person is actively psychotic, people with schizophrenia over time tend actually to have flattening of mood. That's part of the so-called negative symptoms. They tend to have a flatter, less responsive mood that is often linked with what's called avolition, which is an inability to sort of engage yourself in goal-directed behavior or to be interested in things to a degree that you're significantly impaired.
And now, Doctor, was your review of those family records significant at all to your ultimate diagnosis or ultimate opinion with respect to Mr. Chism?
Yes, they were.
How so?
I took account of this family history of psychotic disorder in the form of schizoaffective disorder. And so I wanted to be as thorough as I could about the possibility of an emerging psychotic disorder, or the possibility that Mr. Chism was experiencing a prodromal phase of a psychotic disorder, specifically schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia at the time of the alleged offense.
And did you take into account other information that you ultimately received in your assessment of those possibilities?
Yes, I did.
Now, you had indicated that you requested certain testing from Dr. Kelly Casey and Dr. Nancy Hebben. Is that correct?
That's correct.
With respect to Dr. Casey, did you request a particular test, or did you leave that to her?
I requested a particular test of Dr. Casey.
And which test was that?
That was the Rorschach ink blot test.
And were the results of that test significant to your ultimate opinion in this case?
Yes, they were.
How so?
On this particular tool, there was no indication of a psychotic process. There was indication that at times Mr. Chism will rely on fantasy as kind of a defense mechanism, but that he had no difficulty distinguishing between what is reality and what is fantasy.
And you also enlisted Dr. Nancy Hebben to do some testing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And how were those tests selected, and by whom?
I told her the kinds of information that I was looking to elicit, and she chose the instruments.
And ultimately, did you receive a report from her regarding the testing that she did?
I did.
Was that report significant to your ultimate opinion regarding Mr. Chism's criminal responsibility?
It was.
And how so?
It was important for me to get a picture of Mr. Chism's current functioning, and she did that through the behavioral assessment tool. I had also asked her to investigate specifically the possibility of a psychotic disorder, and I had also asked her to assess the possibility of malingering.
And how were her results significant to you in ruling out or including those two possibilities?
On the basis of her testing, I could not find in the valid tests a basis to support a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder. On the basis of the two instruments that she used to assess malingering, I decided that I needed to actively consider this as a rule-out hypothesis for Mr. Chism.
Meaning ruling out that he was malingering?
Yes, that I had to be very thoughtful about the possibility that the self-reports that he was giving me were either entirely fabricated or exaggerating experiences he may actually be having.
Do you, when you were meeting with Mr. Chism, did you have the results of Dr. Hebben or Dr. Casey's testing, or did you receive that after, if you remember?
I had met with him, I think, twice or perhaps a third time before I had the results of the testing back.
Now, excuse me, let me ask you this as a general matter, not regarding Mr. Chism. When you are assessing, let me ask you this, what's an auditory hallucination? You referenced that, I think, earlier in your testimony.
Sorry to interrupt you. It sounds like you're moving to a slightly different area.
I am.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take the morning recess. I have a couple of matters to talk to counsel about, so the recess may be more than 20 minutes, but I'm going to do my best to keep it as short as we can. Don't discuss the case among yourselves with anybody else. First thing I'll do when you come back into court is make sure you follow those instructions. It's been brought to my attention by your attorneys that you wish not to be present tomorrow for what's called the charge conference. The conference I'll have with the lawyers about how to instruct the jury on the law. Do you understand what's meant by a charge conference, sir?
Yes.
Okay. And you have an absolute right to be present at that charge conference where I will be making decisions on my jury instructions. It's your right under the Constitution to be present for all of that. Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
Also, you can also waive your right to be present or give it up. Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
Now, I've been told that you do not wish to be present for the charge conference tomorrow. Is that true, sir?
Yes.
Has anyone forced you or threatened you to make that decision?
No.
Have you had enough time to talk to your attorneys about that decision, sir?
Yes.
Do you understand that should tonight you change your mind, that you could change your mind about that?
Yes.
Okay. And are you making this decision to not be present for the charge conference knowingly, of your own free will, and voluntarily, sir?
Yes.
And have I confused you with any of my questions?
No.
All right. I'm going to require, in this instance, although I'm going to require in this instance that there be a signed waiver form by the defendant and certified by counsel as well. All right, you may be seated, sir. Okay, I'm going to commit the rape by serious bodily injury or through an assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Obviously, the specific intent is not required for the aggravated rape, but it is required for the attempted. And for the assault and battery with a dangerous weapon issue as it relates to the attempt, there is case law that talks about, in Commonwealth versus Brown, I think the case is, I don't remember the site off the top of my head, 66 Mass Appeals Court, I don't remember the pinpoint site, talking about that there has to be some action that constitutes, for the purposes of this case, an assault and battery with a dangerous weapon beyond the what's need to accomplish the unnatural sexual intercourse. So that needs to be in the instruction as well, and that the crime not be completed. And for the attempt, the defendant's state of mind has to be that, Ms. Ritzer need not be alive. At the time of the overt act, he needs to believe that she is. And so I think if you listed them all, I didn't just count. There's probably 6 intents within intents within intents that I've gone through, and they all have to be outlined, and they're not in the proposal. I want to see if we can finish this witness today, so I am going to stop talking, and I assume any discussion of this can wait from the Commonwealth's perspective, and I assume from the defendant's perspective it can wait. Okay. All right. Let's see if we can reconvene at 11:15 then.